I guess we're not really going to talk politics. This was all a trap that I have laid for me to corner you into answering. Why are you on Twitter throwing shade at the world between worlds?
Oh yeah, it's funny. I was having a conversation with some friends over a text, and I just felt like I would throw that out there. I don't know. It's an interesting thing. The main issue, my main concern with World Between Worlds is that you end up with a potential for all kinds of retconning and parallel universes and things like that, which I don't feel like is a place in the Star Wars universe. I think they used it incredibly well in Rebels. I thought it was a nice way to kind of show the power of Ezra and the power of Ahsoka, but I think maybe that's enough. I don't want us to. I worry about whenever any sort of story goes into that sort of timeline kind of stuff. Although Marvel seems to be handling it pretty well so far. So
yeah, they are. Very different kind of franchise, but
right.
it's a can of worms. I do understand your concerns there. For people listening, the World Between Worlds was introduced in Star Wars Rebels. I don't even know how you would describe it necessarily, besides like it's inside a Jedi temple, and it's like a portal between time and space within the fabrics of the Force. And Ezra is kind of like the first person that we know to like sort of breach the World Between Worlds, as well as Palpatine, who is trying to get into that space as well. And it would, I think, open up the door to them going back. And I think you could charitably say, like, add value to different Star Wars stories and tell spin-off stories and what ifs. But I think the cynical version of what they would do with World Between Worlds is cave to fan pressures on anything that gets enough blowback. They'll be like, oh, well, we'll just go back and correct things in the World Between Worlds.
Yeah, and I think anytime you get into, I think Star Wars is, where it stands right now between even some of the, I wouldn't even call it retconning. I would call it like sort of slight changes to things. There's sort of that hierarchy of film, television, animation, comics, and then or books and then comics. I don't even know where that line is, but it does lend itself to creating bigger problems than it might solve. Again, I thought it was a really creative way to pull to end the Ahsoka Vader confrontation in that particular episode, but I think we're good with it. I think it's fun. I think that's enough.
Well, Pete, you were kind enough to have me on your podcast, Around the Galaxy, where you give really great, wide-ranging interviews on Star Wars and fandom. And we talked about the politics of fandom for an hour. I guess I was coming on as a conservative, right-leaning commentator to sort of share my thoughts on the state of the fandom. Have you gotten in any trouble from talking to me?
No, in fact, it's kind of funny. It's opened some really interesting doors. A couple of weeks after you were on, I had a gentleman who's a much more conservative, right-wing talk show host. It was actually kind of interesting. He was
that must be Scott Reifen.
That was Mr. Scott Reifen, and it was funny because at one point he and I had blocked each other on Twitter over some sort of thing. But I mean, what was so great and so important about our conversation was I think we found that you can have Star Wars really can be that middle ground, and I think just the opposite, as you said. You asked if I got in any trouble. If anything, I think it helped people. It kind of opened their minds to be like, yeah, you know what I mean? Star Wars as a conversation should be where it is. You can be in those two different worlds. And in fact, I think, with the Bad Batch, I think Tech had the best line and one of the most important lines in that is applicable to fandom. And that is, just because I understand you doesn't mean I agree with you. And that's actually okay. And I think if you can get to that point where you can understand where someone's coming from, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be at odds over everything else. And there's this great opportunity to have this great, modern day myth, this great story that has been with us for over 40 years as a common ground for people who have different political perspectives.
Yeah, I think Scott Reifen in particular is an interesting guy. I got to know him just a little bit through Riley Blanton. who's hosted the Star Wars Report for years,
Mhm.
also sort of a Georgia, Atlanta area hometown boy and a Star Wars podcaster. And Riley and Scott, I think, used to collaborate on a political podcast together. And Scott is just a deep Star Wars fan. And my day job is I do a lot of booking for conservative guests for talk radio. So like I'm always looking for shows for my clients to go on.
Mhm.
And Scott's, someone who I got to know through that realm as well, like trying to book people for his show down in Georgia. Him and I actually, I wouldn't say him and I would say I got into a shouting match with him months ago over the Gino Carano firing, because I say a shouting match in that I was shouting at Scott because I was being very defensive of my opinion that she might have deserved it.
Yeah.
And I found myself on the wrong side of my tribe on that issue. I ended up having to go on multiple conservative podcasts and like right-wing shows to defend my position that, actually maybe Gina Carano is like not our avatar and our hero that we need to be like throwing ourselves on the tracks for.
And, I think it's interesting because it happens on both sides of the fence as well. I mean, I think, in the, and I've heard you talk a little bit about it before on the show, is that in the cancel culture, it's like, I don't know that this may be a dangerous way to put it, but I don't know that any celebrity at this point is worth, posting your entire ideology on, because there's so many other dimensions to human beings. And I think that's part of the issue, right? It's the, I think that in fairness, and surprise, surprise, I agree with you that Gina Carano should have been fired. But actually, the really interesting thing about that to me is that she wasn't really fired; she just wasn't renewed. And it's, for me, it's an interesting, and it's semantics and it's a subtlety, but it's kind of an illustration of the use of events to position where you're how you want the story to sound. For me to say that Lucasfilm fired Gina Carano because of what she said and did just is very inflammatory, and it sells the story. It says, you know what, once again, the Disneyfication of politics and Star Wars has ruled the day, and Disney continues to do that. On the other side, if you say they just opted not to renew her contract, which is kind of what really happened, Disney just said, you know what, it's probably better off that we don't continue down this road. And
it's one of those things where I remember having really strong opinions about it when it initially happened. Mm-hmm. And it's several months down the road. I mean, this was like almost a year ago now, and this kind of like all went down. I can't believe where the time has gone. But now I'm kind of like my bullishness on the whole thing is like softened a little bit. I feel like, did she really deserve it? Because like everybody in Star Wars orbit, like they're all airheads on Twitter. Like we all know how like all the actors and producers are. Mm-hmm. Maybe I was like overreacting to the whole thing a little bit. But at the end of the day, I think what you articulated there is kind of what makes the most sense to me, which is your contract isn't renewed because at the end of the day, you have to be like worth the trouble.
Right.
Yeah. You have to be worth the trouble to the producers and to the studio. And she just created nonstop trouble. Right. And you could say like, maybe there doesn't need to be trouble. Maybe there's trouble because entertainment publications are always wanting something to be angry about. But, like, I just feel like when you're in business with somebody, you do things like out of respect to the people who you're in business with,
right?
Such as sometimes just like watching what you say in post.
Yeah, and deciding what's worth falling on the sword for. I mean, the same thing happened to Chuck Wendig on the other side of the coin, right? I mean, Chuck went a bit extreme, and they decided not to continue their relationship with him from a Star Wars perspective. So it does happen. And look, if you're working for Disney, I hate to. Can
you recap the Chuck Wendig story to the best of your ability? My memory is a tad fuzzy on it, but I know he just kind of like went way off the cliff on the other side.
Yeah, I honestly, it was. In fairness, before I got heavily involved in social media, but Chuck had taken a pretty firm stance on an issue and was pretty vocal and used some choice words. Interestingly, I don't think it's the verbiage that that knocked him out. I think it was just sort of the firestorm that came from it. And again, a couple years ago on social media versus today in social media, there's a different level of tolerance for people engaging. Because if you look at it from that perspective, there are a number of people on both sides of the political viewpoints that could have gotten knocked out as a result. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have enough detail other than to know that I loved Chuck's books, and I know he went a little bit extreme on a stance, and he's not going to be writing more Star Wars books.
I always find it so striking to me, and I think like Chuck Wendig's audience, and a lot of the kind of like activist left that are involved in Star Wars fandom. And then you have the reactionary right side of fandom who, you know, their entire like intake of entertainment news is filtered through websites that are dedicated to being upset and angry and you know, aggrieved about the politics of different franchises and producers and movie makers. I feel like all we ever hear from are from the people who think the whole thing is broken because their side isn't getting what they want all the time.
Yeah.
Like you have far left entertainment writers just always complaining there's never enough representation, there's never enough this kind of casting or these kinds of storylines. And then the right just are always looking for something to be upset about. And then regular fans in the middle, like no one ever hears from those people.
Right.
Nobody ever just hears from the people who go to see maybe one movie a month. They like Marvel and they're just interested in having good stories that they can talk to their kids about. Like that's the average consumer.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because, you know, I find that being sort of in the echo chamber of social media and Star Wars as a result of having a podcast and engaging with all kinds of different people, my perspective of what's happening from a political standpoint, or even from a, sort of social decisions being made by a franchise, it's totally skewed. If I talk to, you know, I sometimes forget when I talk to what me and my friends call normies, people who are not Star Wars, you know, total nerds like myself, who are so entrenched. If I was to talk to my dad or my friends from high school or whatever, they would have no idea that somebody, you know, is about the Gina Carano situation, or they would know that she's not coming back, and they would have an opinion on it from some perspective or another. Gina Carano may be a bad example because I did get a little bit more amplification, but like, you know, it's honestly, at the end of the day, studios make decisions because they want that vast middle to show up and take part in whatever media they're selling. So they are, you know, they stopped the Chuck Wendig situation before it got out of hand. They stopped the Gina Carano situation before it got out of hand, before it started to poison that middle ground and cause a problem. And, you know, at the end of the day, we always have to remember that our favorite franchises, as great as the stories are and as insightful and important to us as a society, as your book points out, they're also businesses, and these sort of things that people get upset about on YouTube and on Twitter aren't worth bringing to the rest of the world, probably, as far as, you know, the companies that are making this stuff would care about.
Well, I guess you mentioned my book, and I am curious to put you on the spot, and don't sugarcoat it for me, Pete. What do you think about it? How far in are you? What's standing out to you?
It's awful. It's one of the most difficult books I've ever had to read.
Just pre-order, get your pre-orders in now, folks.
No, you heard it. No, you know what? I really, I'll tell you what's most interesting to me is, you know, and we talked a little bit about this when you were on my show, and you and I have had conversations in the interim. Interestingly, you know, our different political viewpoints can be left at the door, and you're what I really enjoy about the book so far is that you're pulling very specific examples from Star Wars to address bigger issues, and I think that's, when done well, what something like Star Wars can do. Is it can have us face some issues, and some timely issues. I mean, it looks like, if I read it correctly, you were finishing up the book right around the time of the inauguration of 2021, and a lot has happened in the last several years, and to be able to draw a direct line to empathy, to fear, to some of the things that that are happening in the quote unquote real world. And I use quote unquote real world because this is such a crazy real world we're living in. To be able to use Star Wars to be able to have a conversation about some of the real issues of fear and decision making. And I think my favorite chapter is very early. It's the empathy chapter, because I think that's probably what has disappeared most in many of the conversations, whether it's politics or even whatever issue you're trying to have at a conversation over holiday dinner. Empathy is out the door. It's no longer, I live in a family that's got peace and love 60s parents on one side and old school Italian family, like traditional family, on the other. And I have to tell you, during the Trump years, we were very quiet at dinners together because there was such an extreme, and so people didn't. It was interesting to watch this sort of instead of being empathetic, it was sort of, I'd rather not talk about it. And I think that doesn't help anybody, because it just forces us back into our own sort of way of doing things.
In your family dynamic, I mean, do you think that let's not talk about it is actually part of kind of being driven by general like empathy and being gentle towards your family? Because I feel like confrontational people, judgmental people, and people who are being filled up with contempt, like they are contemptful against their relatives for being a certain way politically, they wouldn't be able to keep their mouths shut. So I feel like maybe your family is like, I don't know, like channeling something relatively positive.
Well, but it's interesting because there's the two ways to look at it, right? And I would, and maybe this is why I have a podcast and why I was so excited to have someone with different views like yourself and Scott and others on, because I want to understand. And I think sometimes we fear trying to understand because we're not sure how we're going to respond to learning more. I mean, it's to ask somebody why they have such a firm belief in something means that you need to be willing to accept that they have that firm belief, and then be willing to continue the conversation. And so yeah, I think it's, yes, to your point, is it empathy that stopped the conversation? Probably, but I would also think in some cases it's easier to do it that way.
Yeah, a little bit. No,
Yep.
I think the empathy chapter was like, it was scary to write about, particularly because I went back in and I was like, all right, there's just been like this massive and scary event at the Capitol. Politics getting out of control. Should I even touch this with a yardstick? And I decided to go back in and do it because the chapter's kind of like motivating Star Wars moment was in episode 7 when Kylo has Rey held captive and she calls him a creature in a mask, kind of making an assumption about him. He takes the mask off and then he reveals he's a cute boy beneath, and she's kind of like thrown off her guard the entire time. And that week I had just seen Anderson Cooper on CNN talking about the folks at the Capitol who attended the Trump rally and the people who were also involved in ransacking the Capitol building. And he said about them, I don't have the quote in front of me, but he was like, they're all gonna go back to their Holiday Inn Expresses and go grab dinner at Olive Garden and celebrate what they did there at the Capitol. Yeah. And then Anderson Cooper got dragged for, demeaning everyday Americans who go to Olive Garden, and Olive Garden like issued a statement and all this stuff. And it's so funny because I actually took like real umbrage at that remark. And it was, to me at the time I was writing, it was actually like that whole idea of putting masks on people who you don't like, who you're alienated from, who you feel general contempt for. It was class. It was just it was a comment motivated purely out of class resentment. I think coming from a New York liberal who just doesn't see to eye or understand like what everyday people go through. I don't know. It was just like the cartoonizing of your enemy in a way. And I took like real offense at that. And I ended up putting it into the chapter.
Well, I think it's interesting too, because I think that is one of the biggest challenges over the last several years. And I can't, I would, as a more left-leaning person, I'd love to blame the Trump administration completely, but it's really not fair or correct to do so. But over the last 10 years or so, I'll just pull a number out of the air, we have gotten to that point where if you disagree with me, you fall into this other category, no matter what. And it's, I think it's, I won't go too crazy into the political side of it, but it's the problem with the part of our political system is we're getting marketed to. Our politics have become marketing, and what happens with that is then you start to, anybody who owns a red pickup truck is this person, or anybody who, whatever product you might buy. In this case, you're buying a presidential candidate, or you're buying your senator, or maybe buying your senator is really the wrong way to put it. But
you're buying it's the right way to put
it. It's what's happening is you're being marketed to, and then as a result, strong marketing creates pride and it creates loyalty, and then as a result, you start to bucket the people who disagree with you, and that's where we lose that empathy and that ability to have the conversation.
Yeah, and I think what I touch on a bit in my writing is the idea of like partisan super identities, and how, it used to be that Democrat or Republican were somewhat, I don't know, like empty tags that people would apply to themselves based on what their parents might have voted on when they grew up in a hodgepodge of not very well aligned beliefs. But over the past 20, 30 years, everything from our culture, our marketing, our segmentation style that we take for our entertainment has meshed in with politics and sorted us very neatly into really predictable categories. You can like predict based on someone's income, whether or not they have Netflix and a Disney Plus subscription, and what their zip code is, if they are a Republican or Democrat. And like, you have to like step back and go like, that's incredibly bizarre to me that like you can predict people's political affiliations based on what kind of cable packages they subscribe to.
Yeah.
But like, it is the way the world has sorted out in the past couple of years. And I describe this by talking about the work of Cass Sunstein, who's an Obama administration official, who did a Star Wars book. It's, what was it called? It's escaping me. The World According to Star Wars. And he talks in that book about the theory of group polarization. And he says that it works something like a gravitational field. And in this gravitational field, the most extreme individuals in any group, they act like the sun. And they draw in surrounding stars or members of their political tribe steadily. And they do so by opening up sort of like the Overton window of the debate, by making the debate more extreme. And then as they make the debate more extreme, more people are just sort of naturally beginning to drift in that direction and into the sun. And then over time, the mass of the sun increases and the gravitational force increases with it. And then everything is pulled into the giant gaseous star. And we're all just sort of consumed. And Cass Sunstein kind of lays out how group polarization works in the real world, how it works with the Rebel Alliance and making like a rebellion against the empire actually happen. And I believe it to be true. We are caught in the star.
It's true. It's really true. And it's, again, it causes, it's A or B. There's nothing in the middle anymore. There's nothing, the gray area, it's become, if you are, I think I mentioned to you when you were on my show, I call myself an extreme moderate, but the problem is that is harder and harder to exist in, because, and it's funny, Facebook, shares your memories from years gone by. And I'm now starting to see that regardless of who's in office, I tend to lean toward the other side a little bit, just because I feel like it's that magnetic pull. I guess I can't be comfortable with it. And what it also reminds me is if you're pulled to either side fully, you're not really being who you really are. And I think that's part of the challenge.
Do you find yourself motivated more by the people who you have more in common with politically? Like, I guess what I mean is, do you sort of find yourself as a centrist motivated to move further left because of the way the right is and the way they are increasingly acting? Or do you find yourself more motivated to move to the right because of the way the far left is? Like, do you find yourself kind of pushed in any direction by either side? Or is it about power? Like, who's in power at the time?
I think it tends to be, and because I think who's ever in power at the time tends to influence um, uh, what's happening at the time, and so I end up kind of being, I'm just naturally not comfortable with going with the flow. But it is interesting to see how um, the push and pull of that has made me kind of really question the larger system. And I know you consider yourself libertarian, and I often find myself in those values because of that. Because it's a couple of years ago when Gary Johnson was running, I really was excited by where he was trying to take things, because I think that the system itself is really very broken. And I think we need to have more choice. And I know I'm not really answering your first question.
No, yeah, you're fine.
But it tends to, I tend to find that I'm reminded that I'm neither Democrat nor Republican nor right or left when I look at what's happening in the system. So again, when there's a
no, and I think like that's what's so important. And I think if you are someone who loves Star Wars the way you and I do,
yeah,
like my fandom of Star Wars and my appreciation for it as a child before I was a political person was that I didn't like the Empire. I didn't like bullies. Like my entire political philosophy was built around my disdain for people who push other people around,
right,
who, come into people's neighborhoods with dressed in stormtrooper armor and guns and push people around and tell them what to do. Like that's where I developed my sense of like indignation about power. And I guess like kind of going to the politics of Star Wars, like the reason that I view Star Wars the way that I do, and I get sort of animated in debates about what the politics of Star Wars are, is because I feel like fans, and particularly I think just like mainstream, like left kind of fans who work in journalism and media or in entertainment, they just feel like they cheapen the political message of Star Wars by always being like, well, it's about Vietnam and it's about the war on terror and it's about Bush. Like it's informed by those things, but Vietnam is not going on anymore. Nixon is not here anymore. The war on terror and Bush, well, the war on terror is still with us, but like Bush and the invasion of Iraq, like those things are behind us. What good is the politics of Star Wars unless we apply it then to other things that are like those things?
Yep.
And I get frustrated when people want to talk about like the politics of Return of the Jedi and the Ewoks and only talk about the Viet Cong as if like there's nothing for us to learn right now about what that movie was preaching.
I mean, quite honestly, if Star Wars was so deeply rooted in the politics of the time it was released, and yes, you can absolutely say it influenced it as it was being written, but if it was so poorly written that was all you could get from it, there's no way your book would work, right? There's no way we would still be able to have conversation. So, and I think that's the thing about Star Wars. When we talk about it as the modern day myth, we talk about it as the story that sort of brings us all together. It's the fact that it still works. You can still watch Return of the Jedi and Empire Strikes Back and the prequels, and whatever time they were written and whatever time they were created in, it still is relevant. And so many people have said that, the fall of the Republic looked very much like some of the challenges we were facing in the United States over the last couple of years. And whether or not, regardless of which side of the political aisle you come down on, there's certainly an allegory at all times that the empire is always the bad guy, and that a republic that doesn't pay attention will be toppled. And it's always important to stay vigilant, whether it's 1977 or 2021.
I was a young Republican when the prequels were out. So episode 3, I was 15 years old. I was involved in Republican like local politics, like door knocking and just like helping like do like mail stuffers and all that kind of thing. And I was sort of an activist. And I remember seeing episode 3, and I liked George W. Bush at the time, um, because he was well, I'm sorry, 2005. Excuse me, I'm losing track of time. 2005. I liked George W. Bush at the time because I grew up and I was 11 years old when 9/11 happened. I was scared of the way the world was. He was somebody who like made me feel like we were defending ourselves and taking like control of our destiny. We weren't going to like be held hostage to fear and uncertainty in a way. And I remember seeing episode 3 and going, you know, maybe I need to step back from my trust of this guy a little bit. I remember feeling that way. My friends were talking at lunch at my high school the day after we all saw episode 3, and they were talking about like, what if George W. Bush is the emperor, and you know he's gonna seize control of Congress? And I kind of laughed about it, but you know, like it made me think. I was like, is my fear and my devotion for this president who I kind of was really into as I was a younger kid, like, am I going to be blind to when people like him try to take ultimate power in the name of safety? And I feel like the only people who were ever asked to think about that were Republicans in the early 2000s.
Right.
And ever since then, like nobody has ever been like, okay, you know, this also applies to other emergencies and other crises of fear. But it's always just comes back to Bush. And I'm like, you know what? We need to talk about the presidents who are in right now and presidents who you might like.
Yeah.
That's the point.
And again, I think that's why Star Wars still works, because we can make those parallels in 2005. We made those parallels in 2018, and we can make them now. And I think that's why Star Wars works. And I think that's maybe part of the challenge with where we end up with some of the aggression online is people try to assign too much of their own political agenda to what's happening in Star Wars at this moment. Very much like you were talking about in 2005 when you were sitting at your lunch table. It puts you in a sort of a different mindset when people start applying politics to the story. But I think it's a different sort of thing now. For some reason, there's money to be made, I guess, in being angry about where any franchise is going, whether it's Star Wars or otherwise.
Yeah, and I think the sort of the money driven incentive. So like I guess this brings me to one of my thoughts on your interest in the empathy chapter, was an area where I didn't expect to land on the conclusion that I did, given my political views. Like I'm a kind of a market libertarian, capitalist pig, and all that kind of stuff. And when I was thinking in the empathy chapter about what is the driving thing that makes people more inclined to put masks on their opponents, ignore the plight of the needy, to focus on their own self-interest and their own needs above the needs of others at all times, like to be selfish and to be blind to the needs of others. I was watching Star Wars one day with my daughter. We were watching episode 1. And originally, the entire chapter was going to be based around Rey and Kylo and unmasking Kylo. But then I was sitting there, and it was the moment where Obi-Wan asks Qui-Gon Jinn about him having a disturbance in the Force as they're aboard the Trade Federation ship at the very beginning of the movie. And Qui-Gon says to Obi-Wan, keep your concentration here and now where it belongs. And Obi-Wan says, but Master Yoda said I should be mindful of the future. And Qui-Gon Jinn says, not at the expense of the present. And my jaw dropped, because just the other day, the day before I had watched that movie with my daughter and heard that line, I had just read a study by this woman named Sarah Conrath at the University of somewhere that I can't remember, that empathy as a emotional capacity was primarily driven down in our society by distraction, not by necessarily drive, not necessarily by social media or political media. It was simply that we are distracted. and our ability to actually care for the needs of others goes down every time we have dinging going on our phone, every time we've got notification bubbles popping up, every time we are coming up short in our checking account on our needs for groceries for the week. Our capacity to focus on the needs of others goes down as our needs go up, or our perception of our needs. And when Qui-Gon said that, keep your concentration here and now where it belongs, I went, oh my gosh, I think that this is like Star Wars' primary message on empathy. And I think it actually cuts against my capitalist ethic a little bit.
Well, it's interesting. Just recently I had Misty Rosas on the show. She's the woman who played Queel and Frog Lady, and she'd shared her story of everything she went through to get to where she is today, and the point that she made, and others who have been successful, is to live in the moment. That's a phrase that I hear a lot from successful people, is to learn to live in the moment. And I think that's a variation of that. That's very true. And again, I think that's why I love to do my show, and I love to have conversations with people from every point of view, because I want to get into that moment and say, okay, so why do you feel that way? And I think people are more, in today's world, we are much more likely to ignore where that's coming from, right? I think that it's so hard for people to get comfortable with having a conversation. Again, maybe it's my Thanksgiving family parties. It's more difficult to have that conversation and open yourself to understanding something different. I mean, I'd say every second or third show on when I'm doing my show is I learned something. Like, I got a different perspective. And what is life if you're not constantly learning or constantly getting another perspective? I'm not saying I changed my mind, right? Again, it's just because I understand you doesn't mean I agree with you, but at least to hear someone's perspective is to, okay, so why do you think there's a political agenda being pushed down your throat in The Last Jedi? I don't. I would like to understand what that is, instead of saying, no, you're wrong, that movie was great. It's okay to say, all right, cool, so why? And then also your response to that response is as important as the way you respond to it. So it's a difficult world, and I don't think we're trained, to be able to handle this much constant stimulus, this constant flow
input
of information. And again, I think it's probably basic. I'm no psychologist, but it's probably basic human behavior to be like, okay, I'm going to shut it out and just make sure that I'm safe. I'm going to defend my perspective, and I'm not going to take the time to get to know others. And it causes just aggression, which in the end doesn't help anybody.
The more inputs that we are receiving at all times, the less that we can offer to people. Because the more inputs we're getting, the more thoughts we have bouncing around our mind, the more possibilities that we're constantly always thinking of. I mean, like, my God, like, I can't imagine how it is healthy, or how people lived in the time before us, where they weren't constantly always thinking about their Twitter followers and whether or not their most recent tweet was maybe like irking some people on the other side of the country they've never met before. Like, you know what I mean? Like, when you post a tweet and you're sitting now watching TV with your family, or having dinner, and in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I wonder if Mike didn't like my tweet. I wonder if Pete didn't like my tweet. I wonder if Harry was upset by what I said. And you're thinking about it, wondering what if. You've never met these people in your life.
Right.
You don't know these people. They're just people who follow you on Twitter, but you feel like you have like this connection to them, and you think about them on your spare time. That's time you can't then think about your own children.
Right.
Because you're
you're
thinking about your reputation. Like, it's absolutely insane. We're not built for this.
Yeah.
And we should be like graceful to ourselves sometimes. Right. And to our neighbors and our friends, because we should try to understand that everybody's struggling with this. We don't know how to be human in this time in history.
It's very true. I mean, the example I use is, and I think I may have mentioned this to you in the past, is I did not love The Rise of Skywalker. I have all kinds of issues that this isn't the forum for. However, I'm very cautious to say anything about that because there are followers who, we have so much in common that's like I don't care if people like the same Star Wars as I do. But it's interesting because, to your point, I wonder, geez, if I put this point out there, am I gonna piss some people off? Am I going to make some people angry? Are they going to think that I think differently about things? And
they're going to think you're on the other team.
Correct. Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And there's, look, at the end of the day, it's my favorite phrase is don't yuck somebody else's yum, which I think and that's what I think that's part of the challenge too, is there are people who look for an opportunity to say you're wrong, and that doesn't help anybody. And that is one thing that I think, if I've gotten anything positive from my Twitter experience, is I have literally deleted tweets that I was going to reply with because I realize I'm pushing back on something. It just doesn't matter. If they love it, awesome. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't. And that's the whole thing. What do we both love? We both love something about that. Let's focus on that. And again, I hate to be, I'm not trying to be all peace and love but I am trying to be like,
your parents. You said your parents were hippies.
That's
so
true. I think it's in the blood.
It's showing.
It's starting to come out.
You're live and let live classic liberal.
Exactly. Yeah, I guess so. Yep. But maybe I got some libertarian in there where it's like, you don't need to get all involved in my business. So,
well, like George Lucas, we can't presume what George Lucas's politics are because he doesn't talk too much publicly these days. Right. But he's an old school 1960s, 1970s Democrat, right? And that means something very different to Democrats who are 20 years old.
Yep.
And I kind of wonder where George fits in today's landscape, because we are in the midst of a political realignment where the young liberals, actually we'll call them progressives because I don't think they're very liberal, of today, they look at the liberals of the 90s and 80s and the 70s, and they kind of just view them as like neoliberals and have this like disdainful disgust for them. And it's true that like George Lucas critiqued neoliberalism throughout his work in the original trilogy and prequels. But I don't know. I just kind of wonder if he would fit in at all with the progressive left of today, and if he would be viewed as maybe something else.
Yeah.
I don't know. We're in the field of total speculation now. It's probably not constructive, but I wonder.
But it's an interesting point in that it goes back to one of the first things we were talking about is, what is the place of politics in Star Wars? If it really is a story that is timeless, if it's a story that brings people together, if it's a story that we can all share, the back end politics of it shouldn't be as important. And so whatever George was or is today influenced him, but it's what we're doing with this story and how we're responding to it today that's critical.
Yeah, I mean, George was working on the great philosophies of humankind. He was not sitting down and making a Democrat v. Republican manifesto. Right. That's not a recipe for an international box office success that means something to billions of people around the world. He's drawing on all sorts of philosophy, from the Stoics to Confucius to Christianity to Buddhism, like all the greats.
Yeah.
Politics is like the only way that you view Star Wars. It definitely cheapens it. I struggle sometimes with talking about sort of the intersection that I cover a little bit, because I get a little bit hung up on saying like, well, I talk about the politics of Star Wars. Like, I really believe they're virtues. Like, there are virtues of Star Wars. Star Wars has been made in political contexts. But Star Wars is a story driven by certain values. Yeah. And you could say in some cases its values jump clearly to the left. And in some cases, I think its values lurch further to what you might call more the traditional right. But it kind of depends on like what issues you're talking about. Are you talking about war and peace? Are you talking about welfare and social security? Are you talking about civil liberties versus like militarism? Like, these are things you got to take on a case-by-case basis with Star Wars. And I've just never been disappointed with Star Wars views on things. I think Star Wars is just a story that it just knows the human condition.
Yeah.
It knows the human condition is to muck things up.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of live in that space,
Yeah.
that utopia doesn't exist, that humanity will never make heaven on earth. And therefore, we should do everything we can to make sure that people who say they can make heaven on earth in utopia are restrained as much as possible, because they can't, and they'll just hurt people in the process. Like, that's the way that I view things. And I think that Star Wars, like light side, dark side message, is all about restraining those impulses towards excess.
Well, and I think that's why a book like yours works really well, because I think you hit on something that I haven't thought about before, and that is it's the human condition, right? If it's values, and if it comes down to really deep rooted values, it's like at the end of the day, the bad guy really believes they're right. So if you're coming down to the values, basic human values, as you said, nobody wants the bullies to come in and take over your neighborhood, right? So it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. You don't want that situation. And so you make that connection to Star Wars, and it's when the real world politics start to be applied to it that we lose sight of values, and we end up spending time on party lines. And that's why Star Wars actually does work for both sides of the fence.
We waste our time debating whether or not it's significant that Newt Gingrich's name is used for Newt Gunray. Like, I'm sorry, but that's like the least important thing that Star Wars has ever commented on.
Right. Exactly.
in its existence. It's just kind of like a funny haha. Not something that I would be like, oh, what a profound fact you brought forward there.
If that's the most profound thing from Star Wars, then it's not going to work.
I will say, in the realm of name dropping, I think one of the more interesting things George Lucas did was name General Grievous's ship the Invisible Hand. And the Invisible Hand, which is a term used for the free market, and capitalist forces, the Invisible Hand, crashes into the capital of Coruscant, and within 24 hours, democracy is dissolved. Well done, George.
Yeah.
Pete, from the Around the Galaxy podcast, thank you for coming on Beltway Banthas, talking a little bit of Star Wars and politics with me. I know that. Hi, I'm Stephen Kent. Thanks for checking out my channel. If you liked this video, please hit that like button, leave a comment. I always try to respond to every single one, and subscribe. Hit that button down below so you're getting a notification every time a new video posts. We would love to have you be part of the community, and I look forward to talking to you. If you like Star Wars and you're interested in politics, which I suppose is why you're on this channel in the first place, you should also consider checking out my new book. It's called How the Force Can Fix the World, Lessons on Life, Liberty, and Happiness from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. And it is my love letter to Star Wars and my stating of the belief that these movies, these stories, these books, comics, the characters, they offer us guidance on how we can live better lives, be better people, and possibly, by extension, make our politics a little less crazy, possibly even better. I hope you'll like it. I've put so much love into this book. It comes out on October 26th, 2021 of this year, and it's up right now for pre-order. So hit that subscribe button on your way out. I'm Stephen Kent. May the Force be with you. Always.